What happened back there?
I don't care.
Hey, I've got an idea. Let's rock talk.
Hello, everyone. This is Lord Magicus, and we are doing another MTG Rock Talk. So I actually kind of want to start doing these a little bit more often, so we'll see how that works out. But in the meantime, we have got some really interesting things to talk about today. So without any further ado, let's look at this. Today we had a banned and restricted announcement. Now, we had been told that this was going to affect multiple formats, and it did. It affected Standard, Historic, Legacy, and there was a separate article for Alchemy. And I'm not really interested in talking about Arena today. In fact, the thing I'm most interested in talking about is the elephant in the room that seems to, in fact, not be in the room, which is Modern. So if we look here, Ragavan got banned from Legacy. So we'll start with that, since I think a lot of people knew that Legacy needed some changes, and they, to their credit, they did go through and they noticed, okay, well, the monkey is a problem, but is it the only problem? Because the blue-red Delver deck in Legacy is not even playing Delver of Secrets anymore. Instead, they just dropped it so they could play Ragavan, Murktide, and Dragon's Rage Channeler, and that was just fine. So yeah, Ragavan just absolutely dominating that format, and a large part of it is because it's backed up by days. And if you look back over the history of Legacy, they've had the blue-red X Delver deck dominating that format for basically forever. I mean, even at like Miracle's height, like Delver was still right there with it. So yeah, the back just playing Force of Will and Days together, it is a pretty great engine, and the threats have only gotten better, so it's really, really hard to do better than that. And Ragavan just definitely was one of the things that helped push it over the top. Now, banning it is definitely going to hurt the Delver deck, but to be honest, I don't know that that's going to be enough to stop it. If they still picked up again Murktide and Dragon's Rage Channeler, so I guess they just start playing Delver of Secrets again instead of Ragavan, but that's not really much worse for them. And I mean, their card advantage engine now, they are getting to play Expressive Iteration. So they have a 2-mana, draw 2. That's not really the kind of tool you want to give that deck. Unholy Heat on top of it is another very powerful removal spell for that deck too. So it's just hard to see exactly what's going to happen with this. They do say here that they're going to keep an eye on Legacy and make adjustments if needed. I think that they probably will be needed, but I don't know if the adjustments are going to come in the near future or not. It'll depend. We'll see. But the important thing is they did ban Ragavan from here, but also, kind of as expected, Ragavan's not banned from Modern. In fact, nothing is banned from Modern. Now, I think anybody who wanted Ragavan banned today, it was an absolutely just unrealistic expectation. Ragavan is the Chase Mythic for Modern Horizons 2, and like it or not, we are in the era of Magic where the big expensive cards don't get banned for like at least a year. So you can ban this card from Legacy because Legacy is not really it's not as popular as Modern. It's not really pushing the prices of the boosters at all, so it's not that big a deal to ban it from there. But the more important thing is that it also, these cards don't get banned from both Modern and Legacy for the most part. Like, you have to be extremely over the top to get banned from both formats. And I think that a large part of it is that Wizards wants these cards to be playable, and because Modern Horizons 2 cards are only really Modern and Legacy legal, you kind of have to pick a format for them and say, this is the format that sucks this up. So Modern gets stuck with Ren and 6, and Ragavan, it's just how that's going to be. And unfortunately, though, Ragavan was the least of our worries right now. We have a huge issue with companions, and especially Luris, and Modern's missing from here. So, well, why do we find this odd too? Let's take a look at our history here. notice how like every single year in winter, Modern has had changes. This is the first time in Modern's history that it has gone a full year without a winter banned and restricted announcement for it. So that's actually kind of incredible. And you might be led to think, okay, well, they didn't say anything about Modern, so maybe this means that maybe Modern's going to get its own announcement in February, because that's a thing that happens sometimes. Well, got some bad news. They said absolutely nothing about Modern in this. There was not a single line, didn't even say, "Oh yeah, we're okay with this." So, that's what they released on the website. And to be honest, I don't think that's not acceptable. They should have at least said something. So, this article is released, and maybe like an hour later, we get this. Aaron Forsyth has tweeted out the data and sentiment around Modern all pointed to leaving it alone. There definitely are best cards, but nothing worth addressing. That's a good thing. So as you can see, my immediate question to him is, why did Modern not get the same sort of in-depth explanation that all the other formats got? Because all the publicly available data shows that Luris is one of the most ubiquitous winning cards the format has ever seen. So if the data says it's fine, what metric are you using? I think that's a fair question. And I will show you exactly why I asked this. And we did not get an answer back from him about that, by the way. So that's up in the air. So it looks like, as far, the official position from Wizards of the Coast is they think Modern is totally fine right now. And depending on your point of view, you might agree with them. So part of the problem, or I guess you could call it a problem, there's really two camps of people right now, and neither one of them, I think, are particularly honest with the other. Like, the people who don't like Modern the way it is right now, get labeled by one side as a bunch of whiners who just are never going to be happy. And it's just, I don't think that's not the case. The divide is really between people who like classic Modern and people who like what I like to call neo-modern. Neo-modern is really what we've got kind of since the Splinter Twin ban. Things have been radically different in the format ever since then, and I think I would characterize it as being a lot more aggressive, and I think it's been really hard to find balance in the format since that point. I think when Twin was in the format, things were much more balanced. The point at which Twin was banned, like, Twin wasn't even like that winning of a deck. It was just, I think, more banned because people didn't like playing against it rather than any objective measurement. Because if you looked at its any of the statistics, it was only like 15% of the meta at its height. And that's not a lot, considering we've seen decks that have gone past that and gone much longer without being addressed, and it's not like it stayed there for the most of its existence. I think it was only around like the 10% mark, which is actually that's generally where tier 1 tends to set. Whatever the top deck or two, they fall around that number. So it wasn't excessive by any means. Its win rate was not particularly excessive. So again, if you're going by the metrics, Twin wasn't really like a broken card. I think it was more just a card people didn't enjoy playing the play patterns with. So, and I'm not here to judge whether you like it or not. I personally enjoyed having it as part of the metagame, but I know a lot of people didn't, so that's fine. I am a classic Modern proponent because I feel like it was a lot easier to balance the format then. And to be honest, I don't know if balance is something that we're ever going to find again, but we should try. That's my opinion. However, the people who like neo-modern, they're totally within their rights to like it, because the gameplay is, I'd say, very different. And it also is very, very heavily dependent upon whether you like companions as well. I am not a fan of companion because I don't like all the constructed formats feeling like they're variations of Commander. I want to play 60 cards, and the advantage companions give you is just overwhelming, and we will look at that in a minute. So I find I have a huge problem with that, but there are some people who don't mind the companions and in fact like them and want more companions. No, Modern is not Commander enough. Like, The neo-modern camp tends to be of the position that if you print companions for every archetype, um, that's going to fix the problem. And I would push back against that a little bit because I think that the companion mechanic is very similar to how Moxes operate. You can't really print a balanced Mox. Look in the history of Magic and how many times they tried to print a balanced Mox. The original set, no. You had stuff like Lotus Petal, which is a Mox that you sacrifice when you use it. So that's still as busted as hell. Mox Diamond, there's no way that would fly in Modern. Chrome Mox, nope. So we ended up the most balanced one that we've gotten so far is Mox Amber, which at one point did see it has seen modern play, and the card's actually pretty good. I wouldn't say it is busted yet, but it's something that I think is inevitably going to be as we see lower CMC legendaries printed, more stuff like Isamaru, like Jace Vern's Prodigy and stuff like that. We've even more stuff like Ragavan. Ragavan actually could be the basis, for something like a Chrome Mox Amber deck. So there is that to consider. Mox Opal, yeah, that already got banned for Modern. So the only Mox that I think has not been a problem was the Suspend Mox, and that card is probably never going to see play. And that's really the thing. Like, you can't print a Mox that's balanced. And even if you do, like, say, Mox Amber, it is not going to stay balanced. Like, eventually it's going to break just like all the other ones because the mechanic is just inherently not one that you can balance. And I think the companions are much the same way. Starting the game with an extra card in your hand, or, Luris or Hurion, how they do, you're basically starting with like, 2 or 3 extra cards in hand because of their abilities. You can't balance the game around that. It's not going to work. Like, the difference between starting the game with 7 versus 8 or more cards in hand is just absolutely just nut crushing. So it's not something that I would advise printing more companions, but there's, at the same time, if you print like 100 of them, maybe you'll finally print enough of them where every deck will guaranteed have one. And I don't know how exactly that would play out, but I think it's not a good path to go down. But anyway, the point being, like, those are kind of the two perspectives on Modern as a format. And it's not that I don't think that it's inherently wrong to believe in either one. If you like Classic Modern and you don't like the companions, that's fine. Or if you like Neo Modern with the companions, you know what? That's fine. But right now we have one format with its name trying to be used to describe both of those things. And really, why is that? So this leads me to my next point. Why is it that Modern is being used to describe both of these things? Well, it actually comes back to this guy again. So we'll talk about that. But before we move on, he did address a few other things here. That did mention that in response, people asked him why why Wizards didn't comment on Modern if they think it's problem free. And he's saying that listing the perceived problems doesn't really accomplish much, and I actually disagree with that a lot. And for this reason, you want to be as transparent and open about your communication as possible in order to generate goodwill with your players. There is really nothing to be gained by just not, regularly communicating with the community. So look at what happened with Pauper. They started like a Pauper committee so that, could be more honest and transparent and, informed about these things. So, we have people that actually know and care about this stuff, that they're reaching out and making an effort. Why are we not doing that with Modern? Even if they believe that there's no problem here, clearly a huge significant percentage of the community does think there's a problem. So you would think that even if they're not going to ban anything, like every once in a while, like maybe every quarter or half a year, or even every year at least, at some regular interval, check in and tell us, like, what do you think about the format? What are your goals for the format? And it's really something that should have been done a while ago. And Well, we'll talk about that in a second too. But there's one other thing he did mention. He was asked about, whether there were any unbans that were considered. And again, I think this is a really good thing that could have been communicated in the article and wasn't for some reason. He does mention they talk about unbanning Twin regularly, but Birthing Pod has like zero chance of ever being unbanned, pretty much. So again, now, why do I say that they should be open and communicate about these things? Well, because after they banned Splinter Twin, they already put out an article about this. And it's literally called Where Modern Goes From Here. And here they describe what we want Modern to be. So let's look at this for a second. In the wake of the recent Splinter Twin banning, this was 2016. All right, and the Eldrazi dominance with Eye of Ugin and Ancestral Visions and Sword of the Meek getting unbanned. I'm frequently asked what we want Modern to be as a format. That's a very good question. My answers to these questions should be seen as guidelines that we use to help our thinking internally, but they are not infallible policies. Should players' attitudes towards the format change over time, we're likely to adjust our guidelines as well. Sure, that is totally reasonable. And at the time, this is what they said. Modern should be a fun way to play Magic. Alright? Let you tap into your collection to expand upon established decks and familiar strategies from Magic's recent past. Okay. Offer different types of decks and gameplay than what you typically see in Standard. Not rotate, allowing you to keep a deck for a long period of time. Consist of cards that we are willing and able to reprint. Alright, those are the easy ones. Beyond those, Modern should have a diverse, top-tier metagame featuring over a dozen archetypes, not be dominated by fast, non-interactive decks. Kills before turn 4 are a red flag. Be at a power level that allows some newly printed Standard cards to affect the format. So at this time, they did not have Modern Horizons to put cards in the format that way. So they wanted to make sure that if they're whatever new cards they're printing, they at least want some of them to be played in Modern, which again is a reasonable thing. But now that we have Modern Horizons, like, that has changed. And have as small a ban list as possible that accomplishes all the previous goals. There's room for interpretation in many of those statements intentionally, but this paints a clear picture of how we see Modern. Okay, so if you're like me and you've been playing Modern since basically the inception of it, this is what you're familiar with. This is what their original mission goal of Modern was. But let's look at it. What's happened? Like, let's look at some of these. Not rotate, allowing you to keep a deck for a long period of time. Well, that doesn't really seem to be the case, because if I build a deck, there's a very good chance that by this time next year, that deck is not going to be that's not going to be a competitive deck to play anymore. So it's arguable that it's not rotating, because every time they add like a new Modern Horizons or something like that, they're throwing in so many cards, it's shaking up the entire metagame to a point where it's just invalidating a bunch of decks. Like, for instance, if you played Elves, you've been screwed, because Elves is just awful. Ever since Plague Engineer got added, like, they don't really have any way to fight back against that. That deck single-handedly died from one card being added to it. So their deck is just rotated out of the format, more or less. Consist of cards that we are willing and able to reprint. Well, it's where's the line with this? Like, is Ragavan gonna get reprinted? Like, how long are you gonna wait to reprint some of these cards? Because if especially this is a problem with Modern Horizons, you can't reprint those cards in a standard set, so you have to reprint them in a special set, which means at most you're looking at like a reprint once every 2 years. And when these rares and mythics from Modern Horizons are being introduced to the format to be 4-ofs in these decks, they're gonna get expensive. Look what happens to, cards like Ragavan. It goes over $100 a piece because everybody needs 4 of them, and it's a mythic from a premium set that can't really be reprinted for like 2 years. And who knows even if they will reprint it, like in, say, Modern Horizons 3. It's difficult to say, like, whether they're achieving that goal. The top tier metagame featuring over a dozen archetypes, I guess that also depends upon what you mean by top tier, because and it changes often. So maybe they could be doing this. However, not being dominated by fast, non-interactive decks. Well, there have definitely been points where that's been a problem, but more like look at what happened. They printed cards like Hogak, and then they took 3 months to ban Hogak when it was really a problem. So they did let like the entire summer be dominated by it, and they did the same thing with with Oko. Like they let it go for a month, and it's like I think you probably could have banned it a lot sooner than you did. Like it was very obviously a problem, or the same thing like with Uro and Astrolabe. Like that's just getting jammed in like every deck, and it is dominated by these decks. Now, the thing with like some of them are like more grindy than fast, but like it is still being dominated by a lot of these cards, and the game is effectively over at like a really early part of the game, just because like when Uro was a thing, you had Field of the Dead with it, and that was a problem because you basically couldn't catch up with it ever. So it had the illusion of feeling interactive, but in reality it didn't, because there's not really a way to interact with Modern's lands very well. But the more important thing I'm worried about here, consistent kills before turn 4. There's a lot of decks that can do that. Like Hammer Time, it prides itself on the fact that it can just surprise kill you on like turn 3 pretty consistently if they go for it. Like there's the average turn that Modern really requires you to do something or die. It's a full turn sooner now than it was at the time this article was written. So it's not really a turn 4 format anymore. So whether you want to argue like about it being dominated by some of these decks where it's sure, like it can, like you can say well, maybe they're dominated by interactive decks. You can argue over what this means, but you can't really argue over the turn 4 part of this, where that doesn't really apply to the format we play now, because it's in a spot where like some of these decks like are going really really fast, and it's not that hard for them if they just want to go for it to just try to kill you on that turn. The format is a lot faster now. There's a lot more free spells, so yeah, like even if you don't actually die in turn 4, like the game is already over by that point in a lot of cases. So it's difficult to say that they're really achieving this goal anymore. Definitely though, some standard cards still make it in, but it's almost kind of worse because like a lot of the standard cards that make it in, they've been problems. Like Uro and Oko and Teferi, they're not really great cards for the format, but I mean, they achieve the goal. They just print ridiculously powerful cards in standard that come in, so I guess that works. The problem, though, is they're not going to have a small banned list that achieves all these goals, so when they changed the design with War of the Spark, that essentially meant that they're changing the philosophy in which they used to print these cards. Before, they used to try to be more reserved with how standard cards got printed. Now they're saying, okay, well, we're more willing to take chances on cards, but when you're more willing to push the cards and take chances with them, that means you're going to have to ban cards more often, which is directly, counter to this goal. So, very arguably, like, some or of these rules are just not, they're not reality for Modern at this point. And it's it's really subjective here, if it's a fun way to play right now, because like I said, a lot of people don't like how the companions play, and especially with Luris, the play patterns of it. But the important thing to note here, this is what they wanted Modern to be in 2016. So whether you agreed with it or not, there was a guideline to go by, and then here we go up here to 2020. So 2020, it was brought up that a lot of the stuff in Modern had changed after War of the Spark. The design changed, so the rules should change, right? We just discussed like a lot of the rules don't necessarily apply anymore. So if that's the case, then what's their vision for the format now? And you know what? He agreed. he said, we're committed to the format, and a revision of the mission is a reasonable request. Okay, but it is now 2022. We have not seen a new vision of what they want Modern to be. And that lack of vision from Wizards on what they want Modern to be, that's why there's so much polarization, because there are people that still point to they point to these rules that are here and say this is what Modern should be, and there's people who like what Modern really is now and they say no, this is clearly what Modern should be. Why is it so hard to just get guidance like this? Why can't we have a standard to hold the format to? Clearly there is one, because Wizards, they've banned a lot of cards in the last 2 years. So you would think that, okay, well, if they're banning these cards, they surely have some, standard by which they're doing it. I would hope that they're not just winging it. So it's ridiculous that it has been 2 full years since this. Not even that. This was 2016. This was 2020 when it was asked by a lot of people in the community. And I want to give a shout out, K10 Ken Shinks puts up tons of really great data on MTG Modern Metrics, and there's so much stuff here that's really great, and I try to read a lot of it when I have time. But yeah, no, we got a response back that said no, there's a totally reasonable request. It's like, yeah, I agree. So why haven't we seen it? It does not take 2 years to do that. Not only did we get Modern Horizons 1, we have also had now Modern Horizons 2 for 7 months. And how is it that after 7 months of the second Modern set, we can't get this? That's the source of the problem. That's why people are arguing, and that's why there's so much tension and so much polarization, because we don't have anything like this to point to now to say this is what Wizards wants for it. So now I would like to go and look at the companion. So with that out of the way, remember, he said that, all the data and sentiment around Modern pointed to leaving it alone, and there's nothing worth addressing. So let's look at this. I took all the challenge data since Modern Horizons 2 dropped, and there are about 2,000 decks in my archive here from just the challenges. There were a few days where there weren't a challenge, so I pulled a showcase for that day instead so that I would have data for that weekend. But in general, it's mostly just the challenges. So I pulled all the top 32s for each one of them and categorized them. So I have this nice little data chart here. You can see it tells you all the decks, whether they used a companion, and I tried my best to sort them into archetypes based on whatever the name was. And if you look here, this is the chart of how many Lurises in the top 32 since Modern Horizons 2. So it's been about 7 months. Well, out of all of them, you can see how the companions stack up. We had just about half. 54% of the top 32 decks did not have a companion. So that 45% about 46% here, they were playing companions. Companions, they're adding significant value to these decks now. Luris by itself is 30% of the metagame. Kahira and Yorion are, basically tied with each other for being second and third place. Because and this is the thing, look at these. There's only 5 companions out of the 10 that have actually seen a top 32 in these challenges here. And unsurprisingly, it's all the ones that, their restriction is basically not a restriction. Gigantha barely sees play. There's just not a lot of decks that play it. You have sometimes like Bant Spirits or Tron will play it, but that's really about it. Obosh only really sees play in his one deck, Obosh Red, which, it's not terrible, but his restriction is probably the most balanced of them all, because you do have to give up some actual cards at 2 mana in order to play it. But Yorion and Kahira, these cards, they're basically free. playing 80 cards is not really that big a deal for a lot of the decks, which mostly tend to be the 4-color pile decks at this point. And Kahira is played by a lot of the control decks since we got the elementals. Well, Solitude is an elemental, so having an extra card that you can put into your hand, to pitch to Solitude is a really big deal. And what do they have to give up? They don't play Snapcaster Mage? Well, they have Solitude. Why would they care? Like, having the card to pitch to it is worth way, way more. Like, they barely have to give up anything, and they're just getting free value out of this. So, control decks, yeah, they get to run this for basically free. And again, the Urion is playing 80 cards in a lot of these decks. It's not actually that big of a deal. You can very easily build a Urion deck that is about as consistent as a 60 card deck if you use redundant copies of cards correctly. But yeah, Lurrus, however, is by and large the biggest problem. 30.9% of the decks in the format have been playing Lurrus, and that's almost a third of the format will not play a 3-drop permanent in the deck. That is a galactic warping effect that this is having on it. So, just so we can see, too, this is where we started from, and if you look at the trend line, we are trending upwards. The companions are not going away. They're actually getting worse over time. So, it's not like it's a, it's not like this is just going to magically solve itself. If you look here, Lurrus, it is still slightly trending up here, but I think the thing that's more concerning to me, actually, Kahira is like, going down slightly, but not by a whole lot. But Yorion, if you notice, like, is actually on its way upwards too. It wasn't really until around like October, November that people started figuring out that like Yorion 4 pile is the way to go with this card. So yeah, like until here around, October here, you can see like didn't really see that much play, but afterwards, like it started, it was showing up in the top 32s more and more. Because it's basically free for those decks. So yeah, the companions, they're not going away. Like the average number that we're seeing in any given top 32, like, we just had on the 15th, 22 companions out of 32 of decks in there. So the value of playing a companion is very, very clear, and more people are noticing that over time. So to say that there's no problem and that nothing needs to be addressed, I am very suspect of that. Because cards like Splinter Twin and Faithless Looting, they had their own warping effect in the format, but like Lurrus has a much stronger effect on the format because it's pushing out tons and tons of permanents that otherwise would see play, like stuff like maybe Liliana the Veil. Like that card is never going to see play as long as Lurrus is legal in this format. Absolutely never. It's just terrible. Why would you do that? You give up playing your Ragavans from your graveyard for free every turn with Lurrus. That's just, it's so, and it synergizes with Dragon's Rage Channeler, which is filling up the graveyard every turn. It just creates these snowball effects, and the value is so much higher when you're playing a Lurrus curve versus like the traditional old mid-range curve. Jund decks used to play cards that went up to like 4 mana. They at one point they would play stuff like Olivia Voldaren or Huntmaster of the Fells, but now why do they want to do that? They'll just play Lurrus and like Kroxa, and that's totally fine. They don't need to go above that in their curve. Lurrus is just incentivizing them to do the thing that Magic tends to do over time, which is why when you look at Legacy and you see a lot of the cards like they go down in average mana value, and in Vintage, like that's as low as it gets because they're playing lots of 0 mana spells because of the moxes and stuff. Over time, as more cards are printed, mana curves get lower and tighter, and that's like you're not gonna play like a 7-drop in Modern unless you're Tron. That's just how that is. But you print like a 1-drop like Ragavan, well, that card is going to revolutionize, multiple formats. That's why it had to be banned from Legacy, because it just has a huge devastating effect for 1 mana. That's the direction these deck curves will go over time, and Lurrus is just incentivizing them again to do the thing they're already supposed to be doing. So at 30% over the course of 7 months, and like I said, it's something that it's not like it's getting better. So it's really kind of baffling why you would say that the data and sentiment point to leaving it alone, because the advantage of playing it is just drastic, and it's a huge number of decks that are playing it. So, and they're winning, and it's what data are they looking at that makes them think that it's not a problem? I don't know. So one more thing before we go, and I just want to do a quick bird's eye view of this, and this will be the last point. Um, I, I categorized as many of the decks as I could, as well as I could. I had to go based on the deck name here, so this should be roughly correct, but I'm not going to promise it's exactly right. Because some decks, were just labeled like Teamer Darcy or Grixis Darcy, or they were just like Rakdos or Ragavan. So there's some stuff that was kind of hard to categorize. I think the ones that are generic, like Dragon's Rage Channeler, low curve decks, if you put them all together with stuff like Rakdos and these Darcy decks and maybe the Ragavan decks, they end up around just underneath where Burn would be. So I don't think that it's that big of a problem above this point. I think maybe below this point you could see some stuff move up or down a little bit, but I think this gives you a pretty good idea, because mostly how these decks are categorized, this should be relatively like accurate. So for this, I looked at like the top decks here. These are the ones over the last 7 months that put up the most top 32. So Hammer has been like the top of the meta for a while. You can see it has tons and tons of results, and you have stuff like blue-red aggro encompasses the Murktide Delverish decks. You have your control decks, so like blue-white control or Bant control or whatever kinds of decks like that. Your Crashing Rhinos Footfall decks, the 4-color like Urion decks, or that are playing like the elementals or ephemerates and stuff. Yeah, all like those 4-color value decks and go here. Grixis Shadow is just here. I think there might be a couple Mardu ones mixed in with this, but overall, like the Luris Shadow plan isn't here, so it's still really high at the top. We come in with classic Jund, but this is mostly Jund with like Urza Saga in it. Living End, which has been surprisingly like doing well for a while, and Burn. So like those they're the ones that looked like they were close to the top. So plotted this out here so we could get an idea of like which out of all these decks, over the course of each month, which ones were the ones that were putting up the most total top 32. So again, it's not going to be 100% accurate, but this should give it's pretty close. Like it should give you a fairly decent idea of like how these decks are performing against each other. Because the more results that go up for them, the higher they're going to be. And that should also reflect that they're being played and they're winning more. So here you can see Hammer this blue line, this is Hammer Time. Hammer Time has been at the top of the format basically since Modern Horizons. It hasn't really gone anywhere. So it has stayed above all the other decks the entire time. Oops, yeah, there we go. Now you can see January here. Blue-red aggro, this is like the Delver decks, which it was also very close with Hammer for a while. But if you notice, like, so since November, it started falling off, and then in December, it fell off pretty hard. So it's looking like January is not going to be a very good month for the Murktide decks. Here we go. We have blue, like the light gray line here is our control decks, which they've been doing like kind of middling, but again, they've also been falling off since December, and it's not looking great for them at the moment. Footfalls. Footfalls has been doing it was doing okay for a little while, but it's another deck where it's like around November, like it took a pretty big hit and it hasn't really recovered. Like it still puts up some results, but it's not doing nearly as good as it was before. 4-color pile decks. So this one I think is the one that's most interesting to me, because it really wasn't until September that they actually started doing very much. These decks, I think somewhere around here is where the people figured out that playing Urion and just like 4-color nonsense and just blanking it with Ephemerate and playing all the elementals and stuff is a really, really good strategy, and it just started like skyrocketing and the number of top 32s it was putting up each month. And so now it's like, very, very close to the top here with Hammers and Shadow, which we'll look at next year. Shadow, yeah, I guess Shadow kind of had like the similar story where it was doing it, like, people were playing Shadow, but around like October it started like launching off to the stratosphere here, with where it's to the point where now it's actually right there with Hammer Time, right at the top of the format. We had regular Jund, surprisingly, like regular Jund was doing reasonably well for a while, but similar story to a lot of these decks, around October, November, it started falling off here. Living End's probably the one with the saddest story, because pretty much every single month since Modern Horizons 2, like, Shardless Agent was good for them. It definitely made their deck better, but it's been falling off, and now it's like, it's taking really hard hits, so. And then, the last one here, we have the dark gray line here is Burn, which, started doing well, but now it kind of like inverses with Shadow, which is kind of weird. Like when Shadow was doing bad, Burn was actually doing really good, but then, once Shadow started doing better, Burn fell off. Now it's coming back a little bit, but it's still kind of down here in like this, 15 results a month club with the rest of these. The thing that I want to point out about this, if you look at the top 3 here, Hammers has been up here the entire time. Shadow is on the rise here, and it looks like 4-color has been on the rise. These decks, Luris, Urion. I don't think that's a surprise. Like, the 3, top decks right now are all companion decks, and it's the rest of everything else. Like, sure, you have a few that are here, like, Jund is playing a companion. Burn does have Luris, but they don't really use it nearly as much as like Shadow does, for instance. Yeah, and the other thing is that it does look like, there was a troubling pattern that since, the fall of last year, really is where a lot of these decks started to diverge. Like, a lot of them just took like a nosedive here, and they're all still down at the bottom of this pile, but we still have like the 3 decks that you'd probably think were the top, like, the 4-color Hammers and Shadow, they are in fact the 3 best, and it doesn't look like they're on a trajectory that's going to change anytime soon. So that would be one of the reasons that, like, I'm concerned about Companion, because it's not just that, it's not just theory crafting their advantage. We can literally see it in the results here that, like, the best decks in the format are the ones that are playing the best companions that give them the best card advantage. So it's I don't know, it's troubling to me that Wizards would think that that's not a problem that needs to be addressed at all. Not even that it's not that they don't think it's a problem, but one, that they don't think that is, they don't think it's worth communicating. So that's surprising to me. So I hope that, this went a little bit long, but we got to talk about kind of why things are so heated right now, and get a little bit of a look at what the format actually looks like, from the data perspective a little bit. So I just wanted to do this so that everybody kind of had an idea of, like, I don't know how we bridge this gap between the 2 groups of modern players, but honestly, I think that Wizards needs to finally, like, make good on their promise here. Aaron needs to really push for this, because these arguments are not going to stop until we actually start, getting an answer about what does Wizards want Modern to be. Is there a standard that they're going to hold the format to? Is there are there actual objective standards? Are there data points that, cause them for concern? What are their goals for this? How are they going to determine bannings? Like, those are the kinds of things we need to know, so that the players don't fight with each other all the time about this. That's really it. When everybody at least can be on the same page together as to, okay, well, You may not like it, but this is how the format's going to be. At least then we can have more constructive conversations about the future of the format and whether it's being maintained in accordance with those objectives. But as of right now, we don't have that. And that's why it just sounds like yelling and noise and complaining. It's because the people arguing from it are arguing from two totally different perspectives, and neither one of them has really been, talked about by Wizards, and it just leads to each side trying to divine tea leaves as to, oh, well, they didn't say anything, well, that means they're happy, right? But it's also at the same time like they've also had to ban cards almost every single winter since the existence of Modern. So does that really mean that it's fine? Like, this is the first time where we've gone like through a winter banning where they didn't, and it seemed like at least here that they weren't planning to. Maybe some of the feedback from this BNR might push it so that we'll get a February BNR. Who knows? It's tough to say. At the very least, like I said, I think that no matter what they do, we need to know what Modern should be. We need this format mission statement that we were promised 2 years ago, and so that we can have these constructive conversations instead of just arguing with each other perpetually over, whether cards like Dragon's Rage Channeler or Luris or Uro or Arkham's Astrolabe or Ragavan or Urza Saga, like, were the bans like in accordance with the vision that they had set out for this format? Like, how do we judge these things? How do we get a read on what's good for the format, what's bad? What does good for the format mean? So I think that's where it starts, and I really hope that that's something that we see, but I don't really have the answer otherwise. I know what I personally would like to see, and I know that it's not, not everybody's going to agree with me, but I know that there are a lot of people that are on each side of this, and it can get heated sometimes, and it's just really hard. So anyway, I hope that you guys learned something today, and please leave a nice comment and a thumbs up if you like this. So thank you, everyone. I will see you again next time.
Yeah, that was good rock talk.